All right, I think we'll get started now. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here at this edition of the Three Revolutions Policy webinar series. The title is The Future of Automation Policy from California to DC. We're joined by a number of genuine experts in this field. I'm truly, I've been impressed with all the work that they've done in this space. So I think this is going to be a really interesting session. So our first panelist, and I will advance the slide a little bit. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Molly D'Agostino. I'm the policy director for the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program here at the Institute of Transportation Studies, and I lead what's called the Three Revolutions Policy Initiative. Our work is to ensure that the research has policy impact. So that is my goal. Our first speaker in this segment is the director of the Three Revolutions program. Dr. Circella is the director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program, and he's also a Honda Distinguished Scholar for No Mobility Studies at UC Davis, and he's also a senior research engineer and a professor and faculty researcher in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Davis and at Georgia Tech. So, of course, he's got a number of different areas where he has expertise, and this project on automation is one of his focuses. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Giovanni to present briefly on some new research that we're proud to present today.
Thank you so much, Molly, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being with us today for this webinar. And it's an honor to be with these great speakers today discussing this important topic. I will
So go ahead and screen share.
Yeah, I believe I need to.
Oh, you should be able to do it, and it will just ask you to.
Yeah. I think you can see my screen right now.
Yep, perfect. You can see it. Great.
Perfect. So today I will have the honor of just launching the conversation and setting up a little bit of the stage for the discussion we will have today on such an important topic, such as the policies to regulate vehicle automation. And I will do so really touching a few results from our recent research in this area, and also highlighting some of the policy implications that our work is really having. So I will start to really to discuss the topic, kind of pointing to the famous discussion of the future of mobility that could go either like in a heaven that everybody likes, or hell that could be a big problem for everybody. And many people before me, very, very knowledgeable people, have been discussing how really future mobility could be great if we have every vehicle being electric, the energy mix is clean, as it is already in California. We have increased capacity of transportation. We have more livability in cities, better integration with the public transportation, and everybody shares intelligent vehicles, for example. But also things could go in another way. If we have increased congestion because traveling with autonomous vehicles will be easier and less prone to fatigue of the travelers, the cost will be lower, and so on. Even if we have electrification, we might have electricity produced with a dirty energy mix. And this is the case already in places like China, India today, but also other US states. And so somehow it's something that we need to consider, that electrification not always is good. It depends really on what the energy mix is. We might have increased travel demand, more car-dependent society, reduced role of transit, and even empty ghost vehicles, so repositioning between trips on the network. And really, whether the future will be closer to the heaven scenario or closer to the hell scenario really largely depends on the policies that we shape today. So at the Three Revolution Future Mobility Program at UC Davis, we strongly believe in producing strong research that can inform policies that can contribute to the betterment of society. Specifically, when we look at vehicle automation, we could say many things, because really the impacts of vehicle automation, whether we talk about partial automation in the short term or full automation in the long term in either a shared or privately owned type of vehicles, there could be a lot of factors that could affect the impacts that automation could have on society. And the many sources of uncertainty depends on the business model we shall deploy, the ownership model, but also the land use changes that will happen in the future, the policies that are developed regarding parking, regarding pricing of the vehicles and traveling, and so on. In our group at UC Davis, we have been working somehow to build on the existing literature in this field, but also in developing a few research projects that contribute to advance its size in this sector. In particular, previous studies have mainly focused on trying to understand the travel demand impacts of autonomous vehicles, either using driving simulators and some kind of controlled test beds, or using stated preference surveys, so asking individuals what they will do in the future when autonomous vehicles are more easily available, or also doing some micro simulation and agent-based modeling scenarios in which really they have been making some assumptions and running models and simulations approaches to really predict and create ranges of forecasts for potential future impacts on travel demand. In our group, we've been cooperating on an interesting study, at least I consider it very interesting, as a collaboration between our team at UC Davis and Professor John Walker at UC Berkeley and their team, and so in a nice collaboration between two UC campuses. And we've been actually studying a naturalistic experiment to try to understand what could be the impacts that the full automation in the privately owned ownership model could lead in the future on the impacts in terms of impacts on travel behavior and activity patterns. And so somehow, like, you know, we are in a space in which we want to study a future of interest, which is the one of having a fully autonomous vehicle, which is available to households. And we would like to understand how individuals in the household will reshape their activity patterns and travel behaviors. And we do that not having the possibility to do a full experiment with fully automated vehicles already in society. We do it with a simulation of the future using some personal chauffeurs. And so somehow, like, you know, it's not a perfect comparison, but somehow it's kind of a study setting that allows to study some of the benefits that automation could lead and also inform policy to kind of maximize the benefits that could come from vehicle automation, while at the same time we try to minimize the negative externalities. So we ran a small pilot in the San Francisco Bay Area in the past few years. We already have a paper published on this study, so I will invite all of you to check our results from that study if you're interested. But more recently, in the past 2 years, we've been conducting a larger study in collaboration with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments in the area of Sacramento, the capital of California. And in doing so, we were recruiting 43 households from the previous participants in the SACOG household travel survey. And we stratified them in different ways in order to have a group that somehow included both those that drive a lot, those that are more multimodal, low-income individuals, higher income individuals, different household structures, but also individuals that have some limitations and impairments to driving and so on. And somehow we collected a very, very rich set of data that we could use for the analysis of this project. I will not provide really a lot of details on the research because it's beyond the scope of this webinar today, but if you're interested, please contact us or check our publications on our website. But I will say, like, you know, that I will point in the next few slides to some key results that this study has highlighted. And so finding one, our study has really shown that with all the limitations that we have in the study, we have evidence that some of the benefits of privately owned autonomous vehicles could lead to a sharp increase in VMT and big changes in the activity patterns also in terms of the organization of activities. This would mean also that a lot of trips that are currently linked between the different household members today and with the more trip chaining could become more independent trips if there is more flexibility thanks to autonomous vehicles, with the resulting increase in VMT and the number of trips during the day. Another finding that I want to mention very briefly, and unfortunately we cannot do justice really to this full study today, but participants tend to shift away from transit, ride-hailing, biking, and walking in considerable numbers. And this is something very important to consider because, again, this is a result we don't want to see, and I'm fully aware that we might still avoid this scenario in the future, but we need to make strong policies today to avoid that autonomous vehicles will wipe out the multimodal behaviors that we have today in society. And then I will point to another finding three, which I think is very interesting and very important, is that AVs particularly benefit the elderly and individuals with mobility barriers. And our study has shown that in particular, those with some limitations, either because they are senior or because they have some physical impairment to travel, really benefited both in terms of the amount of travel, the quality of their life, and the level of satisfaction while going through the experiment in our study, but we believe this would be a true actually result of autonomous vehicles. So this is something actually that we need to consider and something that we should really pay attention to preserve as a benefit, even if we want to try to minimize the negative externalities like increased travel demand in our society. Of course, this study has a lot of limitations related to the sample size, related to the analogy between having a chauffeur and having a fully autonomous vehicle. There could be some novelty effect, but I would say we try to minimize all these limitations, but still there are some important limitations to consider in this study. But still, it's important that this study can somehow inform our policy framework. I would like also to quote some of the sentences, some of the quotes that our participants told us. Somehow on the positive and negative side, I picked two that are really not related to transportation, but more related to the quality of life and satisfaction with life. So one respondents were telling us that their life will improve and the stress levels will go down when we have self-driving cars that can really help move around and become the new norm. But others were also saying that if what they are seeing in this study is any indication, Americans will even more sit in vehicles and become even fatter. So somehow this is something to consider, and I really want to close with some policy implications. Our study is really showing that the self-driving cars could change significantly the way we travel. We are showing in this study that privately owned vehicles could really lead to a big increase in VMT when we have vehicle automation. But also it's very important, as we're trying to do in this study and other related research, to identify and evaluate the trade-offs between the positive enhancement and improvements in our quality of life that can come with technology and separate them from the negative externalities. Somehow, I like to quote, the future cannot be stopped, but we can always try to regulate it in a way that we harvest the benefits and will limit the negative externalities. In the past, with Molly and our colleagues in the Policy Institute at UC Davis, we also have developing a set of strategies to support VMT and greenhouse gas emission containment goals during the deployment of autonomous vehicles. Of course, some of these pass through sharing and having more electrification and zero emission vehicles with automation, but there will be also other strategies that are important to consider. And so we think really there is a lot of work to do in this time now, before autonomous vehicles become the new norm, and because we want to really try to harvest the benefits, but also try to limit some of the negative externalities that could derive from the deployment of this new technology, as our study is also showing somehow in our research. I will acknowledge our great colleagues working with us, in particular John Walker and Mustafa Harb at UC Davis, and Jay Malik, a PhD student at UC Davis, working with us. Sorry, I meant John Walker and Mustafa Harb at Berkeley, and Jay Malik at UC Davis, and our supporters in our work at UC Davis that fund our research and support our work. And with this, I will probably pause here. And I think we have a very nice lineup of other speakers. And so I hope I have sparked some discussion with also some of our research findings. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giovanni. Really interesting to see those findings. And, of course, some really interesting policy questions to unpack about increased accessibility and mobility for the individuals participating in that study, and of course how we can mitigate any negative externalities, as you mentioned. So I think with that, I am going to turn to the next segment of our session. And in order for everyone to be on the same page, I wanted to provide a brief overview of some of the highlights from the California Public Utility Commission. Excuse me, let me get this slide going. California Public Utility Commission efforts. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that. And really, what I would like to just ensure that people understand is that this has been a long process. So in November of 2020, the CPUC moved the automated vehicle passenger service pilot to a full deployment. And this was a decision that means that now AV companies can begin passenger service. They can begin operating as, there's many different acronyms or terms used, robo-taxis or automated taxis, automated ride hailing, automated TNCs, transportation network companies. There's so many different terms. And if people aren't familiar with the terms, please, that's a great question to ask and we can clarify. But this process, this decision was a result of a formal stakeholder engagement process. I say formal because it is quite formal. The CPUC's process is quite formal. We were one of the 20 plus parties to the proceeding, but the CPUC behaves or makes their decisions using this formal decision-making process, which does mean that there's typically fewer participants than would participate in sort of broader stakeholder engagement processes. But the decision that they came to does reflect this goal of compromise between cities, advocates, and companies. And so what did they decide? So they made some decisions, right? So the safety was as a top priority. The new program will require AV ride-hailing companies to submit detailed passenger safety plans. These are in addition to the safety assessments that are required by the California DMV. They also made some decisions about accessibility. The CPUC declined to define the term accessibility, despite asking all the different parties for their input on how to define that term, and Davis and others clarifying the way that it could be interpreted to be both broad in the sense that accessibility could apply to people with physical sensory cognitive disabilities, and also be a term that addresses equity for underserved communities. So I think that they were, debating about how to define that term, and as a result, they chose not to define it, which I think is a missed opportunity. But we can discuss that more, and Katie can bring that up, our next speaker. They also discussed data sharing, and they really expanded the amount of data that's going to be collected. And the state is, I think that sends us clear message that the state is closely watching these new AV deployments, and they plan to collect a lot of information about their goings-ons. And I won't bore you with listing all the different data that's being collected, but it'll be exhaustive. But they aren't going to be fine-grained. All the data will be aggregated, and it will be publicly available. And so that is a trade-off between providing more fine-grained sort of GPS level data that could not be publicly shared. They chose to take the route of collecting a lot of different data points, but making it all public and all aggregated. Well, not all aggregated, but all aggregated to the level that they agreed upon. And then related to the environment, the CPUC also really deferred to the efforts that are happening by CARB to enact the Clean Mile Standard, which would, the Clean Mile Standard is ongoing and will apply to automated vehicles. And California is the only state in the country that has automated vehicle emission policy that I know of. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And that is important to note, and we'll discuss that in our next session. So without further ado, I wanted to make sure that people were familiar with what the CPUC is doing. Not everyone, especially, we know there are I think 12 countries represented on our registration list here. So we want to make sure that people are familiar with what's happening here in California. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, who is Katie Angotti. She leads the automated vehicle policy program within the SFMTA, where she focuses, SFMTA is the San Francisco Municipal Transit Authority, and she focuses on automated vehicles. She'll provide more of an intro about her work, and I do look forward to her presentation. So please take it away, Katie.
Awesome. Thanks, Molly. Can you hear me okay? Sound check first.
Looks great.
Sounds great. See my slides? Great.
There was a little problem with the sound in the previous session. So are people able to hear, because I'm hearing Katie at the same level I could hear Giovanni. So are other people able to hear Katie? I apologize to pause your session. I just want to make sure everyone can hear. Loud and clear, I'm hearing louder. She's louder. Okay, great. She's louder, great. Fantastic. Okay, Giovanni, you may want to bump yourself up for the Q&A because people were having a little trouble hearing you.
Awesome, great. I will get started then. There we go. Okay, so first I just wanted to provide some context on our agency, the SFMTA, before diving into the new CPUC rules. The SFMTA is unique in that it brings together into a single department functions commonly carried out in multiple departments or even multiple levels of government. SFMTA not only operates the transit system in San Francisco, but also manages the streets, including on and off street parking, curb management, traffic engineering. We provide for crossing guards, parking enforcement. We manage the scooter program, striped bike lanes and crosswalks. We oversee the taxi and paratransit program. And we overall strive to provide a safe and efficient transportation system for all users. Our broad responsibilities give us a unique vantage point for considering the opportunities and risks arising from automation. We have a very small AV team, but that team is supported by our colleagues that have a very broad range of transportation expertise. I know that people on this call today are, from all over the country. And so for those of you that don't know San Francisco, we are a small city by area, just 47 square miles. When compared to other counties in the US, San Francisco County has the 5th highest density behind 4 of New York City's boroughs. We do have a density gradient. So we have greater density on the east side of the city. For those of you that are familiar, this is like North Beach and Nob Hill, but even in the more residential areas on the west side of the city, we have few streets that look like the wide suburban streets a few miles south of us on the peninsula. So as you can see, we're surrounded by water on all 3 sides. We are land constrained. We are not widening our streets. We are not building new freeways. We will need to move more people on the same limited roadways. This is our geometry problem. So how can we use limited street space to maximize mobility? Our challenge is balancing the desire for individual convenience against the necessity of system efficiency so that people can get across the city quickly when they need to. We know from research conducted by academics, notably UC Davis, and I quote from one of their recent studies, personal AVs and AV ride-hailing services are likely to increase vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions, exacerbate traffic congestion in city centers, and potentially lead to suburban sprawl. Targeted policies must be put in place to ensure that these solutions are effective, end quote. It's possible that COVID effects may exacerbate VMT and greenhouse gas impacts of AVs, but it's too soon to really say which pandemic era changes will be long lasting and which will quickly fade when the pandemic is over. So we believe that AV regulation should be informed from the past. It should be informed by our experience with TNCs, since many AV developers are envisioning a ride-hail model. I know people tuning in today, as I mentioned, are from all over the country, and that TNCs have had different impacts in different locations. But today I'm going to share the San Francisco experience. In San Francisco, TNCs have contributed to congestion. They have not alleviated it. San Francisco County Transportation Authority study found that between 2010 and 2016, busy transit corridors, you can see in this slide that same upper east side of the city, northeast side, there's busy transit corridors downtown, saw 120% increase in vehicle hours of delay. While this was a period of business and housing growth, the study concluded that TNCs accounted for 51% of the increase in traffic congestion. A more recent Fair and Pierce study of 6 major cities found that almost 13% of VMT in San Francisco is generated by TNCs, and about 40% of that VMT comes from vehicles that contain no passengers. We call this in the industry deadheading. In other words, in San Francisco, TNCs significantly slowed travel times for everyone and increased local greenhouse gas emissions. The California Air Resources Board recently found that TNC's vehicles emit approximately 50% more greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile traveled than the average passenger vehicle. We recognize that there are key differences between TNCs and AVs. We understand that some companies have committed to all electric, and we think that's fantastic, where the electricity grid has a high percentage of renewable energy sources. However, the potential increases in deadheading or low occupancy VMT will slow travel times and increase greenhouse gas emissions from the large majority of vehicles that are still on the road that have internal combustion engines. There are also congestion impacts from people shifting from more energy efficient modes, such as transit, walking, and biking to use of AVs. So when looking at the environmental impacts, we can't just solely look at the AV vehicle themselves. We have to consider their impact on the entire transportation network. And we're eager to hear how the industry plans to make AVs a climate solution rather than a climate problem. So now shifting to the CPUC, the recently issued decision reflects a multi-year proceeding in which the Commission received many rounds of recommendations from a wide variety of parties, including UC Davis, as Molly mentioned. A key feature of the passenger services authorized under the pilot regulations adopted in 2018 is that they prohibited both sharing rides and charging for service. The latter restriction, charging for service, is consistent with regulations from the California DMV that prohibit a developer from charging for service before obtaining a deployment permit. And I believe Prashanthi is going to get into more detail on that aspect. So some of the key features of the CPUC decision. So we want to applaud the CPUC. We think it was great that they adopted these initial high-level goals for AV passenger services related to passenger safety. So, passenger safety, access, equity, and the environment. These goals, we believe, provide the foundation for developing outcome-based regulation, in which the Commission defines desired outcomes, so these goals, to ensure that AV passenger services contribute to, rather than detract from, California's overall safety, equity, and climate goals. The decision also adopts a permitting process that includes some tools for public accountability in relation to the goals. So in light of the significant record of criminal assaults on and by TNC drivers and passengers, and the risk to passengers in shared rides that include no chaperone, if you will, the decision requires permit applicants to submit a plan explaining the applicant's methods for how they will keep their customers safe. The Commission also increases transparency by requiring approval of applications by the Commission in a public process. We think that this will enable public safety, accessibility, environmental equity experts. Some of you are on this webinar today, and community stakeholders will enable them the opportunity to provide input on issues that the Commission may not have otherwise appreciated. Finally, the Commission adopted detailed data reporting requirements to support analysis of the service delivered and support development of future regulations. So permittees, Molly mentioned that this information is going to be publicly available. Permittees may argue that some of the data should be confidential, but the Commission adopted a presumption that the data will be available to the public. So this will help researchers like those at UC Davis and elsewhere evaluate the impacts of AV passenger service. So the Commission regulations are not yet final. The SFMTA and our county colleagues asked the Commission to reconsider the decision to incorporate compliance with CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. We offered a proposal for how the Commission can do this without delaying implementation of the decision or making any changes to the requirements for permit applicants or permittees. The decision itself and the comments of many parties demonstrated that most researchers project that AV passenger services could have a significant impact on the environment, As Giovanni shared, some of the studies suggest increases in vehicle miles traveled that would in turn increase greenhouse gas emissions, criteria air pollutants, toxic air contaminants, and public transit delay. Aside from being required by law, we think CEQA provides a structure for analyzing these potential impacts in a way that will support better policy and operational outcomes in the future. It could even facilitate deployment as developers of AV passenger services seek local approvals for maintenance and operational facilities that they'll need in order to deliver services. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Prashanthi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. And we are closely following that CPUC request for a rehearing related to CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. This is absolutely fascinating. You know, from a research perspective, we couldn't weigh in whether the rehearing request could go move forward, but we're eager to see what it comes from that, and certainly the research may be able to support the outcome. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Prashanthi Raman. Prashanthi serves as the Director of Global Government Affairs for Cruise, an all-electric autonomous vehicle company. She oversees global public policy, government affairs, as well as regulatory issues, which is the focus of today's discussion. So prior to her role at Cruise, she worked as heading up state and local government relations at Lyft, and also working with Illinois Governor Pat Quinn's office, and previously was a healthcare attorney, right? So we've got two attorneys in our session, which I think will add value. So without further ado, thank you so much, Prashanthi, for joining us. And please, do you have slides? You do.
I do not.
Oh, you do not, right? Okay, I should know this. Okay,
everyone here. Thank you so much, Molly, and thank you for the invitation to be here and with all of you as well, and hope everyone is staying safe. Just to start off at top, talking a little bit about Cruise. Cruise is an all-electric self-driving fleet company with really the fundamental premise is that we believe the status quo has too many limitations. It's too polluting, it's far too unsafe, and isn't a viable option for everyone. And that's really the motivation of what we're trying to change with our extraordinarily long-term vision of being a self-driving car service that will impact transportation in a number of ways, both within passenger as well as in goods delivery. So, you know, with Molly shared, I run global government affairs. I work on public policy issues and inside of various regulatory regimes. Have worked close with Katie, her counterparts across the country as well, working additionally with legislators, regulators, and other stakeholders, really in order to move AV policy forward in a way that balances the needs from the government side, as well as deliver benefits to the public that we believe are both safe and efficient. You know, I wouldn't be, I'd be remiss if I wouldn't actually go into a little bit more of the backstory of Cruise and its fundamental premises of a premise of where we do not want to launch at a community, we want to launch with it. And, you know, a recent story of that, which really kind of, if we can think about it, over a year ago, almost over a year ago, when the pandemic started and the shelter in place orders began, we really faced a question on how we could do our part in serving our community. We knew that food insecurity had been one of the most profound impacts from the pandemic. The demand had been completely unprecedented. So we actually partnered with San Francisco Marin Food Bank, SF New Deal, and reached thousands of people virtually overnight who needed to be reached virtually overnight. And so I think for us, we really felt that we could come in to redeploy our fleet and perform this essential service and to go where we are needed the most. Two major kind of buckets of categories that came out of that is we to the date have been over 150,000 meals and grocery drop-offs since we launched our Stand with San Francisco partnership last April. We've been able to actually reach 5,000 individual households as well as community organizations the statistic that I find most shocking and also most heartwarming is 82% of our deliveries have actually been to households in zip codes below the San Francisco poverty line. So while we are serving, individuals and the public in a very direct way, separately and aside, we are also really showing our commitment with regards to our electric fleet. And we have actually been able to save nearly 100,000 pounds of CO2 emissions. That's the same positive environmental impact as 57 acres of old growth forest through our Stand With SF program. So we're very, very excited about what we're doing here in San Francisco, and in sort of a case study in what we are hoping to bring to the community as we continue to move towards commercialization of our rideshare program. I think one of the things that both Molly and Katie have discussed is sort of the very basis of the CPUC. But one of the things I want to talk about as well and sort of tie back into the CPUC is how it relates to cruise and our permitting structure here in California. We have two regulators, both the DMV as well as the CPUC, and we've been able to really have positive rapport with both of them. Most recently in October 2020, as many of you probably have seen, Cruise received a permit from the California DMV that actually allows us to begin driverless testing in San Francisco. For those of you who are local, may see our cars orange and white driving around the streets. But it's really a milestone for us in the culmination of years of tremendous engineering work in partnership with our communities and our stakeholders. And really what it kind of symbolizes is the culmination of actually more than 5 years of testing with the driver behind the wheel, millions of miles of cumulative testing of our AV technology, and a testament to the regulatory process in place at the state level. So we know the California DMV already approved our permit application and essentially acknowledges the technological and safety progress we've made. And we can continue to make progress towards that offering of service to the public. We're not doing this in a vacuum. We've actually worked with several communities like first responders and community groups to make sure that they feel, again, part of the journey. We've been doing this since we first started testing in San Francisco, and we continue to do this as we start to go along the path of our driverless testing and then hopefully towards deployment. And so the way in which we now are looking at the CPUC, it's really a culmination of many, many months and it's a couple of years of hard work, thoughtful collaboration from probably many of you on the call, but really the commission, industry, local jurisdiction, and advocates. We have at Cruise have participated since the very beginning, with watching the CPUC issuing its initial proposed decision allowing for a pilot test program for AV passenger service all the way back in April of 2016, followed by a robust pilot program participation, public meetings, workshops, numerous sets of comments. And then this really kind of took place in an all-day public workshop in October of 2018. And then, of course, as we've seen, in December 2019, they signed commissioner ruling posing two robust sets of questions and correlating comments from parties that were filed over a large period of months. And then the last 6 months, of course, have seen the proposed decision and then the unanimous approval of that decision in November of 2020. One of the things that I'd like to share just from the commission's, from Cruise's point of view, is that additional applause and sort of echoing Katie's applause in having, all these, having a decision. It was a lengthy process. So issuing final deployment rules allows for some regulatory certainty for the industry. And that is something that we've really been seeking in order to further expand both testing as well as deployment. Some of the other pieces that we've really been positive about and seeing in this decision is fared service, both regards to individual as well as shared rides. That's really critical in being able to provide a pathway to commercialization for AVs. And it's really important to continue developing this life-saving technology. And we are working on ways to improve. And I think the fare collection really allows the public's engagement to ensure that we're having positive outcomes for potential passengers. We have realistic feedback, aligns with trends in other state AV programs. And so that really was positive to see. I want to sort of highlight the shared rides component, because I think that is just a testament to the potential to reduce congestion, environmental impacts, and reduce costs for consumers. So the additional kind of components that I'll talk about from Cruise's perspective that we really appreciated was allowing for, one uniform set of regulations and not having a patchwork of different regulations across municipalities. We know that, and Cruise believes that it has to be an important partner with localities. It is important to have engagement and feedback for localities, but really if you look across the board, particularly in California, and a feasibility to launch across the state with 59 counties and 121 cities, it's much more challenging to have sort of localized individual frameworks and much easier for operation purposes with a service that is inherently transient, as transportation is, to have one sort of uniform set of rules. And so I will stop there, because I think that I want to be cognizant of Molly's schedule, and we'll pass it back to her, but happy to kind of speak further in the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Prashanthi. Very interesting to hear the AV company perspective. We certainly are closely following your work. So with that, I think we're going to actually switch gears again. We've got 3 segments of this event. The first was the research world and new findings in the research, and the second was California and a focus on the California Public Utility Commission. And for the final segment, we're actually going to turn to DC, to what's happening on the federal regulatory side. And our goal for the Q&A would be to put all those together. So I will share some slides to catch you up on what's happening in that federal regulatory picture. Excuse me, while I get everything organized. So can you see my slides? Yep. Okay, great. I think that, whoops, I did this a little bit. We're gonna have to run through the CPUC slides again. Sorry, here we go. We're on the federal AV regulations primer. So please forgive me. I think it's important that we all to pause and recognize that not everyone is familiar with this pretty complex regulatory world. And our speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment, is truly an expert, and it can expand greatly on what I'm introducing here. I just wanted to make sure people weren't swimming in a pool of acronyms they didn't understand. So the first I'll mention is the U.S. Department of Transportation, the USDOT, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which we refer to as NHTSA, has provided several possible strategies to change AV regulations on the federal level. They recently announced a occupant protection for vehicles with automated driving systems rule. And that is, while that's a final rule, it may not be published in the Federal Registry until the administration changes, and it may not be published at all. Kevin can speak a little bit more to that. They've also proposed a rule that would create a new safety framework for automated driving systems. This is not for the vehicle necessarily, this is for the automated driving system, and that's an important distinction that we can also discuss further. They've also proposed a rule that would provide additional exemptions for the federal motor vehicle safety standards, which we'll go into a little bit more here. And they're also in a pre-rule stage of considering whether revisions to the existing federal motor vehicle safety standards are needed for AVs. So I've said the term federal motor vehicle safety standards a couple times. We refer to that as the FMVSS. for researchers and others who may not be familiar with this this federal regulatory process. There are many classes of well, several classes of these federal vehicle motor safety standards, or FMVSS. Some are listed here in this slide. The ones highlighted here were from a research project done by NHTSA to identify which FMVSS may need reform related to automated vehicles. So we are sort of focusing on the safety side here. But before I turn it over to Kevin to expand more on what FMVSS reform may or may not be needed, and what the framework for automated vehicle safety could look like, I'll just mention that we see a lot of gaps in the federal efforts around automated vehicles, and certainly the issues that California is addressing head on, like emissions, like equity, like accessibility, they aren't necessarily being addressed yet here. So we're looking towards that, towards the federal government to take a broader approach, and we can discuss more about that in the Q&A. But without further ado, I will introduce our next panelist, who is Kevin Vincent. He's a consultant and an attorney. He was the former chief counsel for NHTSA, so he comes with a incredible amount of experience on how NHTSA develops and implements regulation. With that, I'll turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, you do not have slides, so I'll just stop sharing so you can, whoopsie, you can see, so we can see your face. So
okay,
please turn your video on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that introduction and for preparing those slides. They are helpful. I do not have the best voice for these type things. So if I start cutting out or if I sound too quiet, please let me know, and I'll try to speak closer to the microphone. So Molly did a good introduction on the acronyms NHTSA and FMVSS, but let me give you a little bit of background on the agency and on the FMVSS. NHTSA and the FMVSS began in the 1960s, and NHTSA has over time added new standards to the body of the FMVSS. But the bulk of them were all written in the 1960s and the 1970s. There have been a few added since then. There have been modifications to the FMVSS since the 60s and 70s. But essentially 99% of the FMVSS was written with the assumption that the control of the vehicle would be in the hands of a person behind the steering wheel, which is incompatible with an automated vehicle, at least a driverless automated vehicle. Level 3 automation would still have a driver, of course. But level 4 and level 5 automation, the driver, the person is no longer in control of the vehicle. And the effect of the historical development of the FMVSS is that there are a lot of provisions in the FMVSS that actually stand as a roadblock to the development and to the putting autonomous vehicles on the road. You can test them, but you can't sell them and you can't put them into service for the public until they pass the FMVSS. So the Trump administration has written a lot, has used a lot of ink to write a lot of documents on the FMVSS and on autonomous vehicles. Most recently, they've issued a report which they entitled a comprehensive plan. That was actually not NHTSA, but the Department of Transportation issued a comprehensive plan just 6 days ago on January 11th. And that document actually does a pretty good job of summarizing the various steps that the Trump administration has done over the last 4 years. But frankly, it is mostly ink, and it has been little progress in changing the regulatory barriers, or more importantly, in my view, putting in place a regulation, a new FMVSS that will regulate the new driver of autonomous vehicles, which is the automated driving system, the ADS. NHTSA has had some proposals for dealing with the automated driving system, regulating that to ensure its safety. And that the most important one came out only a week ago, and that was on January 11th. No, January 13th. So less than a week ago, NHTSA issued its ANPRM, which is Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So it's not even a notice of proposed rulemaking, but it's a preliminary notice seeking comment on how it should establish a regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles. That document is out for comment right now. It was issued, actually that notice was issued in December, but it comes out for comment in February 1st is when the comments are due. So that's the most important step that NHTSA has taken so far to regulate the safety of autonomous vehicles, as opposed to proposals for how to remove the barriers to autonomous vehicles that are in the existing FMVSS. The most recent document from NHTSA was actually a final rule that was has not yet been published in the Federal Register, which does remove for 4 different FMVSS in the occupant protection area, and Molly had referred to this in her first bullet, to remove language in those FMVSS that would preclude the deployment of autonomous vehicles. But that is a small subset of the different barriers that remain. So turning back to NHTSA's ANPRM, again, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking with comments due February 1st, that document, I am preparing comments in response to NHTSA that will be filing February 1st in conjunction with Saving America's Future Energy, SAFE. Some of you may be familiar with that group, which is based here in Washington, where I am. In that comment, I'll be referring to an article I wrote this past summer, in summer of 2020, which proposed my own regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles. And what my regulatory framework that I'm proposing does, and again, we'll be submitting it to comments, and that will be formally published by SAFE in the first week of March. We haven't got an exact date yet, but we'll invite you to the rollout we'll have of that safety framework, but it will also be attached to the comments we file February 1st. But what I propose and suggest to NHTSA in my regulatory framework that I suggest is that NHTSA take several steps simultaneously to regulate the safety of autonomous vehicle, not just change the FMVSS to allow autonomous vehicles. That is something that needs to be done, but more importantly, add new regulations, new FMVSS to ensure that they operate safely. And the way I propose to go about doing that is that NHTSA adopt the industry standards that are now under development and are scheduled for rollout to go final this year, several of them, and over the coming years. There are voluntary industry consensus standards, and there's actually a statute that's been in place for years that requires NHTSA and all other federal regulatory agencies to use voluntary industry consensus standards when they do rulemaking. And when IEEE comes out later this year with their standard for autonomous vehicle safety and the existing voluntary standards that are already out there in final form, NHTSA could be in very short order, in a matter of months, not a matter of years, adopt those final voluntary industry standards as a basis for a new standard or multiple standards in the FMVSS. That will provide assurances to the public and to safety advocates that autonomous vehicles will be safe, and will also provide the regulatory certainty that the AV industry needs to go ahead and develop their autonomous vehicles, because they know the rules that they will have to meet. If left to the normal practice that NHTSA follows, and if you look at the position staked out by the Trump administration, NHTSA will take many years. The Trump administration has done a few things that I agree with, and I'm very partisan. There's almost nothing the Trump administration has done that I actually agree with, but they have done a few things that I think were helpful in the autonomous vehicle realm. But the one area I think where they have not been helpful is that they are planning a sub-regulatory approach where they're just going to rely upon voluntary guidance instead of an enforceable rule that NHTSA can enforce in the FMVSS for autonomous vehicle safety. So I propose that those standards be adopted, that the industry standards be adopted in the FMVSS. But the most important thing I propose in my paper and in my proposed regulatory framework is that NHTSA change the way it does enforcement through its Office of Defects Investigation, ODI is the acronym NHTSA uses, to change the way it conducts enforcement of standards through ODI and from its historical approach. Historically, NHTSA takes data, aggregate data from looking at each model, and once it reaches a level where it determines that a vehicle is unsafe compared to its peer vehicles, NHTSA will open up a defects investigation. That by definition means you have to have multiple crashes, you have to have multiple incidents for NHTSA to have enough data to conclude or to question whether there may be a unreasonable risk to safety. The advantage of autonomous vehicles is every vehicle collects tons of data, and you can get near perfect accident reconstruction with every single autonomous vehicle that is involved in a crash. So NHTSA can react if it changes its normal way of doing enforcement to a single crash to determine that an autonomous vehicle may be defective. And so what I'm proposing as part of my regulatory framework is that NHTSA beef up ODI to have a very explicit focus on autonomous vehicles, that it require data to reconstruct from the autonomous vehicle every crash involving an autonomous vehicle, and that NHTSA react to those autonomous vehicles crashes anytime it determines that the AV could have avoided the crash or caused the crash, to require a change to the autonomous vehicle design, the programming of the automated driving system. That's a fundamental change in the way NHTSA does enforcement, but it is something that it has a statutory authority to do. And I lay that out in my paper. It's a long paper. I mean, we're relatively long, 25 pages. It's posted on my LinkedIn page right now, but we'll be filing it with NHTSA in a little over a week on February 1st. And I would refer you to that for more details about the framework that I'm proposing to ensure the safety of autonomous vehicles. I could say a lot more on this. I could probably talk for an hour, but I think I'm at the end of my time, at least for this segment. Molly?
Thank you so much. Yes, really, really interesting stuff. So someone asked what ODI stood for. I just thought before we move on, I would clarify that. It's the Office of Defects Investigation. It's a complaint, right?
That's good. Yeah, I did say that, but I probably mumbled it. So, but thanks for saying it again. Yes.
The Office of Defects Investigation is, yeah. There's a type of complaint that can be filed with NHTSA. Okay. So moving on to our next segment. So we actually are going to introduce, bring in some of the other speakers that spoke on the state side to address this sort of what the federal side as well. So I'll turn it over to Prashanthi again to speak to from her perspective, her industry perspective on federal regulation. So thank you, Kevin, and Prashanthi, please.
Thank you. So I think I'll break up my comments into just the ANPRM portion and then sort of the need for federal framework. You know, Kevin, I would love for you to stay on video because I want to see you're nodding, because I do agree with many of the things that you've stated. So, you know, I think we all have seen the research and acknowledge, and a lot of why Cruise is building to autonomous vehicles is really the potential to dramatically improve road safety. And federal standards are a critical portion of that. NHTSA, or the concept of it, based on 1966 or thereafter, has really regulated vehicle safety technology since for quite some time. And so establishing these new federal standards particularly for autonomous vehicles is ultimately is what is going to unlock the actual potential for this industry to continue to grow. And I think the question that was so astutely shared is just how we get there, which is what I think the new ANPRM is seeking to answer. Those of us who have worked in an agency who have been part of the promulgation of new rules knows that it is extraordinarily time intensive, and then also it requires a lot of data, which is what Kevin was speaking to as well. And we're establishing national standards, so it's going to require that extensive real-world information on autonomous vehicle performance at scale, as in various geographies, not just of course California. And so that's where really the A/B testing and deployments come in from an early phase, and it's why it's so critical for the development of the technology and the work of NHTSA. Having vehicles on the roads is what generates that information, which NHTSA can then use to develop AV standards. And so it's sort of like, analogizing, those with kids, you can't force the baby to jump before it crawls. You need to sort of teach it. And similarly with NHTSA, you need to see how the AV is actually working in order to establish enough information for it to be able to develop those standards. Cruise's point of view on sort of the need for federal framework, we think it's critical and it's fundamental to a continued development. To be able to provide, so the safety, the environmental and accessibility benefits that we've been sort of talking about through a large portion of this discussion. It's really in no one's interest to have 50 different states with 50 different standards. We know that vehicles are going to cross state lines every day. They're going to cross county lines every day. A federal standard is going to ensure that consistency. But we do know that it also has to modernize those safety standards to account for autonomous vehicles. And I think that's the ultimate goal for all of us. And that's the work of NHTSA. I think the question comes back to again and again, like how we get there. And, I think that speaks to really the importance of the partnership and the collaboration between government and industry. And it's going to be partly regulatory and partly legislative. If you read the recent ANPRM, it actually becomes clear that NHTSA needs more information before it can create federal AV standards, and Congress has a critical role in unlocking that by creating a framework that allows industries to step up the technology's deployment at scale, which can then feed back into NHTSA's rulemaking. So really the two have a symbiotic relationship, and Cruise is very supportive of having a federal standard.
Great, thank you. So I'll invite Katie to come in and speak to the city perspective on federal policy, federal regulation, and then we'll bring in Giovanni last to round out our Q&A.
So thanks, Molly, and thanks for those insights from both Kevin and Prashanthi. I think we're all pretty much in agreement on the need for federal standards. Our federal priorities for AVs are really lumped into two kind of categories: safety, accountability, and disability access. So safety accountability, this means ensuring that AVs truly do perform safer than human drivers before allowing large scale deployment on public streets. We think that this requires a shift from voluntary guidance to iterative development of safety requirements and standards that all AV developers must comply with to establish at least a minimum threshold of safety. I think this is consistent with what Kevin has laid out in his recommendations and will help build public trust for a technology that's still very much in development. This also means required federal collision reporting and the establishment of a national AV collision database for all test AVs and AVs that are commercially deployed. Collision reporting should be required at the federal level. As Kevin mentioned in his paper, NHTSA should review every collision to determine what occurred and whether it was caused by the ADS so that any hazards can be avoided going forward. Equally important to us at the local level is disability access. AVs have been touted as a technology that will expand mobility to seniors and people with disabilities, but we question how this is possible if none of the vehicles or prototypes we've seen for ride-hail service can accommodate a person in a wheelchair. We must collectively understand that an unregulated AV market will not serve people who use wheelchairs. Federal regulations must require that manufacturers deliver wheelchair accessible vehicle models and must require that AV passenger services providers offer equivalent services to people who use wheelchairs so that urban system can help all residents in their area thrive. So those are our local priorities at the federal level.
Great. So I'll join. Thank you so much, Katie, for those thoughts. I think that it's really important to understand, various perspectives as we look towards the new administration developing federal regulations. So I'll invite all of speakers, to join me and back on the stage here, please. What we'll do is I'm going to go through a couple of questions that I've developed. That's my my main privilege as a moderator. But I also will weave in some of the really fantastic questions that I'm seeing in the audience. But I think we're actually, one of the questions I had really relates to a question that was raised by the audience, and it speaks to what Katie just finished talking about around accessibility. So I want to address that first, and then we can think a little bigger picture. So first, you mentioned that accessibility is an important priority for San Francisco. I find that interesting from the that this is a top priority from a city perspective, but certainly heartening. So several of the participants, Richard Ezekiel and Prashant Venkataram, who is a postdoc working with us at the Revolution. So thank you for this great question about disability access, particularly wheelchair access on AVs. So do we think that where within the regulatory framework it should prescriptive or guidelines exist for encouraging more AVs to be accessible? Is there a federal role for this? Is there a state role for this? Is it both? I'll turn it to. I think that's an important question, and I wondered who may have an answer. So it's a toughie, though. So I'll give you
thoughts if you want.
Please, Kevin.
Okay.
Thank you.
I actually think it may need to be a state role, at least initially, because there is no federal framework other than maybe ADA, Americans with Disability Act, maybe. And I have to think about how that would even work, because I'm certainly not an expert on that. But at least from the Department of Transportation standpoint, none of the modes, none of the agencies like NHTSA that are part of the Department of Transportation, I think have that within their organic requirements to be doing that. Certainly NHTSA does not have a mandate to ensure accessibility in its standards. Its entire focus is safety or fuel economy through the corporate average fuel economy standards. So I think eventually you could have one role for federal legislation could very well be adding on to NHTSA the authority to require accessibility for autonomous vehicles. And that sounds like a good idea to me, but it's not part of NHTSA's current statutory authority to tackle that problem. So I think states can probably get there first with legislation and with a rewriting of the existing authorities in the federal agencies. You could get there through NHTSA or some other part of the Department of Transportation. But I would suggest right now California can take the lead on that, like it does in so many other things.
Yes, great. I'd like to turn it to Prashanthi, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Could you speak to the industry perspective on automation and accessibility? Is there a pathway for wheelchair accessible vehicles in your fleet?
Sure. I think just to bucket, I think it's helpful that we talk about wheelchair accessible vehicles because accessibility and disability are much broader buckets. And so you just be mindful of like what our targeted conversation topic is. So I'll speak, I want to acknowledge that I think that there is an ability particularly for autonomous vehicles to really, kind of push the boundaries of what all disabled communities have been able to experience thus far. But secondly, with regards to sort of the wheelchair accessible vehicles piece, is something that, I think we're considering. To the question of whether it should be a federal or sort of a state standard, I don't know that we should, I can comment appropriately. I don't know if there is sort of a good bucket in the federal government, as Kevin was alluding to, where accessibility sort of falls under. And so, the CPUC has established and has discussed accessibility as a part of this proceeding with regards, and we know that it's very important to the CPUC. So if it were to happen at the state level in the state and laying out sort of a state standard, it's important to remain flexible and iterative with regards to that process, because each company may see and may define or come up with or invent different ways in which to meet wheelchair accessible vehicle community. I think from Cruise's standpoint, we also recognize that our success won't happen overnight. There's no one size fits all option. And that's not how inclusive, product design actually works. And so we want to remain, and what we've done is kind of continue to remain nimble and work hand in hand with the community, leverage our engineers and designers, and commit to, a more accessible transportation future. I think that we have to have like holistic collective actions that address the issues endemic to our transportation system. I think we might all here agree that this has been a constant question in the transportation space for several years. This is not just unique to autonomous vehicles. This also includes legacy systems like taxis and public transit, and as well as new technologies with regards to ride sharing. And so it is one of the core motivators at Cruise, and it's something that we feel very passionately about. I think you can probably tell from my comments and sort of the emphasis on them, but I think we are trying to figure out what a longer term solution is for us, and we're doing that in taking feedback from the stakeholders as we build out what that next phase looks like.
Great. I'll invite, actually, I think it's interesting to hear. Giovanni, I know that your research really reflected the fact that among the chauffeur study, speaking to the issue of accessibility, was there findings that were related to this?
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I saw a note in the chat box earlier saying that when I was speaking at the beginning of the meeting, some people could not hear me very well. So I hope you can hear me well now. Perfect. Definitely in our study, we have seen that individuals that were having some mobility limitations and in particular physical impairment, not allowing them to drive, not allowing them to ride public transportation properly, they were actually those that were benefiting the most, not only in terms of the amount of travel, but also in terms of the quality of their life. This could mean like a reduction in travel time, for instance, to access their jobs, or a better scheduling of their activities and better satisfaction with their organization, their daily life, because they could actually remove some of the barriers. So I think we are talking about an opportunity that we have here with technology, if properly used, to really improve the life of many. And the question is how to, first of all, make it accessible to all. And the second also how to regulate it so that we can provide it across different income groups, different geographies and so on. And I know that is something that is in the mind of many of us in the research community, but as well as those in the policy world and in the industry sector.
Right, great, yes. Great. So I think, Katie, would you like to speak to this, or would you like to?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted. Yeah, I mentioned it as a federal priority, but just to answer your question quickly, we think that this is both a state and a federal issue, and that states regulating services should address disability access, and that the federal government should require developers to invest in wheelchair access. If there's no current approach for this, we're hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration will address this. And just going back to Giovanni's findings, he mentioned that it could increase mobility for some people with disabilities, but uncertain as to whether that's people in wheelchairs that are not collapsible.
Right. I think that's an important point, that during the CPC proceeding, and there's been a lot of discussion about how we can separate between sensory, physical, and cognitive disabilities, and how communities can prepare for increased mobility options for all people within those categories. So I think that it's a big question, and it's difficult to answer it in this relatively short period of time. But I think it's one that deserves more research and more attention. So appreciate to hear that. Glad to hear that everyone's on that same page. So I think I'm going to turn back to sort of a broader question about state priorities. And I'll ask Prashanti to start this one off about state priorities for regulation. So beyond the issues we discussed, or maybe repeating them, to what are the state priorities from an industry perspective on automation?
Sure. I think a few fold, really, if we're thinking about it, and some of it will be a repeat of my former remarks, but a clear path to deployment. I think the CPUC's decision that they voted on in November really did provide regulatory certainty in order to do so. So, it's a great kind of unique threshold for other states as well. There's of course other very, very strong AV state policies on the books in other markets as well. So want to acknowledge that testing in a real world environment, ensure that testing is really permitted in domains that match where deployments will ultimately occur. So, really having that ability to do testing. There are states, ordinances and bills that have a little bit of a variance on how they allow testing to happen. And so really kind of be making sure that a robust and comprehensive allowance of testing is able to happen in a real world scenario. And then statewide applicability, we talked a little bit about that with regards to having one unified statewide framework to avoid a patchwork of regulations that will inherently create conflict, really complicate compliance, and could potentially further delay testing and deployment. I think the other ones are probably being service neutral. So, allow for both the transport of persons and the delivery of goods for autonomous vehicles. And then I think the last may be just a technology neutral approach. Governments are, we'd encourage the government to allow new technology to sort of mature and avoid overly prescriptive approaches. So similar to what we were talking about just in the previous question, because I think if too overly constrained frameworks may inadvertently constrain like progress, innovation, impact, and just sort of the creativity that comes into designing a lot of these newer technologies. I think that is the main the main few fold that I can think of at this time, and hopefully my other fellow panelists will have other things to comment on.
Yeah, this is an important question. So I guess we've done some research on this too, from the Policy Institute side. So this issue around federal preemption, where the state purview should end and where the federal should begin, I think is an important opportunity for more research, for more discussion. Do any of the other panelists want to address this, or should I move on to another question, because I think we've got a lot to cover as well.
I can briefly address preemption if you want, Molly.
Please do, yeah.
It's explicit under the Motor Vehicle Safety Act that when NHTSA issues a FMVSS, when it has a standard, that standard will preempt any state regulations that conflict with that standard. So right now there's a lot of room for the states to regulate autonomous vehicles, specifically because NHTSA does not have any AV specific FMVSS. So the really, you could do lots of things with a new statute, which and I hate to argue with Prashanti, but I actually don't think a new federal statute to deal with safety is useful. But I do recognize that when NHTSA is ready to issue FMVSS, that will preempt. And then the question is, what does the standard cover, and then what falls outside the standard?
Exactly. Like, we'll have to closely follow what happens if there is a new standard, how that affects existing state policies that really do vary across the board. Kelly Fleming has developed a good paper comparing state policy actions on automated vehicles, which we can add to the chat. And there's a lot of different activities. So how will federal policy affect those? I think is an important and ongoing question. So I think I will turn now to a question that is sort of about how do we put this all together. So my question was, how do we see federal and state policy interacting? And I think that gets to this question of preemption that we just discussed. So beyond that, what other issues are we concerned about interaction?
I'll take that one, Molly.
Please.
So we echo what Kevin had just mentioned, that there's some efforts to convince Congress to turn the current Safety Act language upside down and preempt state and local regulations when there are no federal safety standards. And we think that this is irresponsible, given that there are no safety standards. So states are really the only backstop right now for safety. And so until NHTSA acts, the states should continue to have that ability to make sure that there are safe operations of AVs on their roads. And when the federal government does issue standards, then states will yield to those. Another issue regarding state and federal interaction, and this is something we talked a lot about NHTSA. I'm going to introduce a new acronym, FHWA, which is the Federal Highway Administration. And so, there's a lot of promises, if you will, out there about AVs having superior perception and planning and execution capacities. And so we were really surprised to see when the FHWA, at the request of a leading auto advocacy group, put out for comment modifications to the manual on uniform traffic control devices. And so for folks on the line that are engineers or planners in cities or states, you're very familiar with the acronym MUTCD. And so the proposed changes are basically premised on the notion that AVs can't see or understand signs or road markings very well, and they need help from traffic engineers in order to drive safely. And so this came as a shock to us because the idea that AVs need certain road cues is a huge departure from what we've come to understand from the industry and how the technology works, at least in San Francisco streets. And so if these changes are made, FHWA would be telling the state and local traffic engineers why the technology is still in a developmental stage to start designing and building our roads to accommodate these issues that AVs are allegedly having today, right now, rather than support the safest possible driving environment for human drivers. And so there may be a time when traffic engineers across the nation should be thinking about how every design and marking and traffic control device will influence automated driving, but it seems at best very premature to be doing this. And the proposal, argues universal adoption of road markings designed for highways, but interstate highways and urban streets are very different and need different treatments to maximize safety. So we think the FHWA should recognize that it's premature to move in this direction.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Great. Well, I think I'm going to turn now to audience questions because we have many. And I apologize to the audience that we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best and may be able to address some of them after the fact. We'll see. So the question I think I'm going to turn to is a question for Giovanni. that came in early. It was about sort of bigger picture discussion about AV impacts on VMT, on vehicle miles traveled. The question came from Leah Kaplan, so thank you for asking the question. And the question is basically asking, how do we compare VMT from an empty automated vehicle with VMT from a grocery delivery? How do we think about these different VMTs, and I guess if you can, for the full panel, how can we connect that better to policy? So Giovanni, do you want to start by addressing this question?
Absolutely, and I agree with you, Molly. Actually, there are a lot of questions from the audience which are excellent. So sorry for to all the people in the audience that have posted great questions. We will not have the time to answer them. Our apologies to them. This question about VMT is excellent. Definitely, our study has shown, as other studies are already showing, that the contribution from ghost VMT and vehicle miles traveled basically attributable to vehicles that don't have a passenger inside, which is somehow the equivalent of what we would have today with the TNC, with the deadheading miles when we have a vehicle from Uber or Lyft that is relocating between trips pretty much. They can account for a pretty sizable portion of the additional VMTs. And our study has shown that these, depending on the different urban, suburban context, the density of the trips can vary a lot, but they can account for a pretty large percentage of miles, up to, in certain environments, up to 40% of the additional VMT that are created by autonomous vehicles. And of course, if we look also what simulation studies have been saying to us, we can see also that this can be reduced if there is a critical mass of trips. So pretty much the ends of the trips are happening closer to the beginning of the next trip. If there is a critical mass of users, and also in the balance of trips by time and geography. And so if we have somehow the way to rebalance different vehicles accommodating the trips of other passengers. Somehow this is relating very closely also to the freight side. As the question that was posed by the person in the audience raised, already trips in the delivery of goods and meals today with the Uber Eats services or DoorDash or all the other services that we're seeing today, they're already contributing a lot to increasing VMT and to also occupying curb space. And this is also another topic we haven't talked a lot today, but I think it's very important to talk about in the local area, because that contributes also to interfering with traffic conditions and also creating more disruption. And so it's a topic that also we should dedicate more time in the future also to focus our policies. Somehow, it's something also to consider in terms of business models. So the more operators on the network, the lower, of course, the efficiencies that we can reach with the critical mass. Now, of course, nobody wants to have a monopoly in which, we have one operator that maximizes all the efficiency in managing the fleet, but at the same time, some potential coordination or some way for the policy angle or for pricing to try to balance that need to reduce the additional VMT with at the same time, managing multiple operators being on the network, maybe actually a space that we should spend some time in particular to consider, the impacts on traffic and environment. And I will pause here because we don't have a lot of time. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. So I think the last question I'll ask is about emissions. We'll close talking about the environmental impacts. We initially, Katie introduced that the San Francisco is considering, whether the state and whether there's been enough done to prevent any environmental impacts. And that question, I think, remains. I think there has been a lot of efforts, and there will be. And of course, by 2030, 0% of emissions can be connected to these vehicles. So is that enough? Can we go further? Is the Clean Mile Standard enough for California? How could that be applied to the federal? We got 2 minutes, so we got 30-second answers. So Katie, do you want to speak to this first?
Sure. I think it's important to look at the system as a whole. I think I mentioned this in my comments earlier. It's not just about the vehicle itself and making sure that vehicle, doesn't emit greenhouse gas emissions, it's congestion is part of the equation as well. And if there's congestion on the roadways, then the other vehicles that we're going to continue to drive on our roads for the next 20 years have internal combustion engines. And so if they're sitting in traffic, they're emitting, there'll be air quality impacts and they're emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that we need to take a systems level approach to this in order to have better environmental outcomes than we've seen with the current situation with ride hail.
Yes, thank you for that. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question around
I have a thought on that too. I think NHTSA, if it takes a broader look at what it means to protect safety and thinks about protecting the public safety by eliminating exhaust from vehicles, which is not a traditional way of evaluating safety. But if it adds that onto the evaluation of the direct safety benefits of avoiding crashes with AVs, it could require electrification as an element of the FMVSS. Certainly by statute, Congress could meld that onto the requirements for autonomous vehicle regulation. And any federal or state money that is spent on AVs should make it dependent upon that the vehicles be electric and not just autonomous. That's most of the light duty stuff is using electric vehicles right now, but in the heavy duty space that may be necessary because there's a lot going on with diesel vehicles.
Yes, good point. Heavy duty. We didn't really address that today because there's not enough time. There never is. I want to close here, so I want to thank all of these really brilliant panelists. I really learned a lot from all of you, and I really appreciate you coming and participating. And we get to continue this conversation because we have upcoming our next event for the Three Revolutions Policy Initiative is the Three Revolutions Policy Conference, which is our annual showcase event. Showcase, showstopper, something like that, where we really are going to have another virtual event this year, a 2-day event that will be from morning until 2:30. So 2 meaty half days. So please put that on your calendar, save the date, March 3rd through 4th. And there's more information on our website, but the registration page is not quite live, but we will send it out to all of you to register as soon as that registration is live. And we can't wait to have you participate in that event. Really looking forward to continuing this very conversation about automation and federal policy. Actually, in 3 months, there may be a lot of action on that. So, could be action on the state level, it could be action on the federal level. So I think it will certainly have a lot to discuss when we reconvene in March. So thank you all so much for joining me today. Please continue to look at our Three Revolutions website for more updates on our events and our research as we continue to publish a lot, and we have a lot of events upcoming. So thank you again, and I'll close the webinar there. But
Molly, I will add a very brief comment. I will add a very brief comment. There were some good comments and questions about land use and other topics. And I think we can reserve them for the Three Revolution Policy Conference in March, where we'll have more time to discuss these topics, not only greenhouse gas emission and traffic, but also these other important topics.
Great. Yes, absolutely. And I will read those comments and questions. If there's a way for us to quickly get back to you, I will. And I'll try to make that happen. All right. Well, thank you again. And we will, of course, publish a recording of this webinar. And that question was asked. So, of course, the webinar will be published. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me and I can direct those questions to our panelists if necessary. So thank you once again. And thank you, Natalie Ruiz, for helping administer this event. And thank you to all of you for joining us.